Hey. I think I'm live. I think, therefore I am. Hey. I think. Oh. Alright. Hello, Twitch. I am live streaming. This is my first time ever. I don't really know what I'm doing. So, just trying stuff out. But yeah, I think I'm live streaming right now. That's pretty crazy. Yeah, look at that. Okay. Well, for all you people who have been live streaming in the past, this isn't really that big of a deal, but for me it's kind of a big deal because I'm finally live streaming and my cat is going to totally just be here. Okay. So the title of this stream is making cool things in Maya. No, it's not. It's something about Vray and Maya. I don't know. Maya Vray lighting settings. All right. So yeah, basically what I'm just going to do right here is show you guys some of the lighting technique or the lighting settings I use when using Maya and Vray. You know, really quick, easy stuff. Nothing crazy. But, you know, I've been doing professional Maya lighting for the last 12 or so years. And, you know, people always ask me whenever they're starting to get into Maya, or, you know, animators or people who aren't necessarily spending a bunch of time rendering and lighting, you know, what's a good just starting point? Like, where do you start? Chum, please, buddy. Just over there. So where I like to start is just a pretty nice preset render globals and some initial lights just to sort of get things going. And so that's what I'll set up right here. So let's just make sure that Vray is running, which it should be. And it is. Okay, great. Okay, and next I'm just going to turn on actually let's just first start by creating some simple stuff. So let's make a plane. So we have a floor, and I'm just going to scale that up using the middle mouse button and just moving left to right to gesture in that direction. Alright, I'm turning off the grid because that's kind of annoying. And let's go over here and just make a, let's see, what's an interesting shape? Let's do a torus. Torus isn't something I use very often because, you know, you don't need them too much. For making a tire, I'd probably start with a cylinder. If I was making a donut, I would probably start with a torus. But I think that might really be the only time I'd use a torus for donuts. Yeah, or maybe Fruit Loops or something. I don't know. I don't really make Fruit Loops that often in 3D. In any case, so let's just go over here and go to render globals, switch this to Maya Vray, and here's basically where I'm going to start messing with some stuff. I always turn off don't save image because every time you finish the render, it saves all that information down into your temp folder. And you know, that's all fine if your renders are nice and small, but you know, if you have a 1920 1080 size render, or even, you know, just a bunch of channels in there, it's gonna hang up your system for like a good 15 seconds after the render finishes, and that's just annoying. So just leave that off until you actually want to save your temporary images. Next thing here is convert image to sRGB for render view. That'll make sense as I go along. I also turn off this hide render view button, because here's what I do. I open up the render view, and I leave it open, and I just keep it kind of off, tucked away in the corner. A lot of people leave that checked on because they're like, oh, that render view is so annoying. I use the Vray frame buffer. What do I need that for? Problem is, if you leave that checked on, every time you hit render, this pops up, full screen, massive, gigantic, and then it hides. Or it just moves into your view and it doesn't hide, and it's just an annoyance. But it always pops up at the size that you're rendering. So if you're rendering 1920 1080, it's just going to be this giant window that pops up over your screen. It's super annoying. So if you leave that unchecked though, and then just tuck it off nice and small down here, every time you do a render, this won't change at all. It'll stay there. And then you can also throw your history into this little frame buffer, which I find to be like super duper helpful. I know the Vray frame buffer has its own history, but I really don't like it. It's really slow. It's very cumbersome. It's very rare that I need to check the passes of my previous renders. I just really need to see the beauty so I can do before and after, and I use the render view for that. It's pretty helpful. All right, so that pretty much sets that up. I'm just going to set this to 1920 by 1080, and it automatically sets my height, so that's fine. Go to the Vray tab. Progressive is great. It's a great new rendering type for Vray 3.1, I believe, or 3.0 or 3.1, one of them. But I still use adaptive almost exclusively, just because that progressive, it still takes a long time to start your scene up and start calculating, and then you start getting the image back. But I find that if I just turn on GI and use light cache as my, or irradiance map and light cache for my GI settings, I kind of get the same thing. I get that little preview before things go. So I don't really feel it's so necessary to like have, the progressive style rendering active. So I'll switch it back to adaptive, which is the old school method. And 1 and 4 subdivs is usually a good starting point. Sometimes I like to start with 1 and 8. And I also like to set my threshold a little bit up, so 0.03. So 1.8.03, and this is just, putting this threshold above 0.01 starts to make the image look overall grainier, but it also renders a lot faster. And allowing up to 8 max subdivs is going to allow your samples to sort of look a little better. We can go into this stuff as we go, but there's this really great set of tutorials called Mastering Vray from Grant Warwick, and I would highly recommend checking those out, and you can get a bunch of information about how to optimize and set all your settings, your DMC threshold settings and your samplers and all that stuff. But just as a starting point, 1 and 8, 030, and then I set my adaptive mount to 0.95 from 0.85. I never set this to 1 because then it tends to undersample. 0.95, you're at least forcing a few samples at some objects. This is basically a threshold. If you put this all the way to 0, then it's going to use the maximum number of samples you have on each material and each light, which is way overkill for most of the time. If you set this all the way to 1, it's going to make it the most adaptive it can. So if it only needs 1 sample, it's only going to use 1 sample. But sometimes it doesn't quite, like, it thinks it only needs 1 sample on a really dark object that's very, very much in shadow, but it actually needs more. So the 0.95 just sort of forces it to use at least 16 samples, and then it'll go away and do its own thing. All right, so let's do that. And then color mapping. The only thing I really set on is subpixel mapping. This linear workflow button doesn't really work anymore. It doesn't do anything. And effect swatches, it just makes your hypershade, all the swatches kind of gamma up to 2.2. I find that to be a little distracting. I'm so used to seeing it all in a more of an sRGB fashion. So I just don't leave that at effect swatches. I leave that off. And otherwise it looks good. Okay, moving along. GI. So GI I almost always have on. Brute force is great. It's way too slow. Of course, if you're doing animation, brute force is a little bit easier to set up. Radiance map totally works for animation, but you have to do pre-passes. We can get into that as we go along. Radiance map though, so that's good. And then we'll set our custom settings, -3 and -2, 30 subdivs, and then down here on light cache, I'm going to drop that down to 500, which was the previous default. So basically, this just reduces how much GI is being cast into the scene, makes the renders go a lot faster, and it still looks pretty darn good. I mean, sometimes I even use this for final renders. It just depends on how much light is in the scene, how much direct light versus how much GI and all that. But I think for the most part, -3, -2, 30 subdivs is pretty solid with 500 subdivs for your light cache. Moving along to settings. For some reason, if we just twirl down this default subdivision tab, for some reason, these guys over here at Chaos Group are like, 256 max subdivs. That seems fine. That is outrageous. Max subdivs should be around 4, maybe 6, if you're really feeling crazy. View dependent, I always leave this off. And if you're doing a still, then you can leave it on and it's probably going to speed up your render times. But I typically do animations, and in an animation, what that means is if an object is this close to your face, to your camera, then it's going to get a certain number of subdivs. But if it's all of a sudden this far away from your camera, sorry about my nails there, if it's this far from your camera, then it's going to start getting a little crazier. It's going to use less subdivisions, and therefore you're going to see a pop if that object is on screen as it transitions between using 12 subdivisions to using 4. That's just terrible. So if you turn off view dependent, then it's always going to use the 12 no matter how close or far away it is from your scene. All right, so moving on here, 64 on the render region is really big, especially when doing test renders that are going to be, because I'm going to set my test resolution down here to like 25%, which is only 480 by 270. So if I'm doing 64 on that, it's filling up almost the whole frame with these gigantic buckets, and that's going to take a long time to render each bucket. If there's like it's especially intensive render element underneath the bucket, that bucket could sit there for the entire render, and everything else could render and be done, and that bucket will still be working. So I'm just going to go down to 24 here, just to make sure that it's a little bit more adaptive and my CPUs are being put to better use. Dynamic memory limit, they just finally added this feature, so now I can type in -3000 instead of like 5000, for example. So essentially what I'm doing is 3 gigs less than the maximum amount of RAM that's on this computer. So this is a 32 gig machine, so 3 gigs less. I'm using 29 gigs of RAM. Really great if you have a render farm too, and your render farm is comprised of tons of different computers with different configurations. You know, one's got 16 gigs, one's got 64 gigs. This will always be adaptive to that, and just take 3 gigs away for, you know, other computing processes like renting out frames or browsing the internet or whatever. So -3000 is pretty solid. And then last but not least, render elements. Here's my go-to set of render elements. These are in there in every project I work on, and I think they're just the basics, the essentials. So you need a diffuse, an extra text. We're gonna actually add 2 of those. Lighting, normals pass, reflection, refraction, specular, z-depth, and finally sample rate. And we'll just add all those. I'm just holding control to add the other ones. I'm going to add a second extra text, and here's what I'm going to do with these extra texts. Click this guy, and then over here in Vray attributes, I'm just going to add in a Vray dirt, which is great. I'm also going to bump the samples up to 32. I'm also going to turn on double-sided. This just means that it will occlude properly on the back sides instead of just being flat black, and work with transparency. And that transparency they're talking about is on your lights. So if you create a Vray light, like let's just make a Vray rectangle light, and if this Vray light was penetrating through the floor like that, in our occlusion pass, we would see an occlusion from this light. It would be like a black edge. But, oh, well, that's until I turn off invisible or turn on invisible. So now the light is invisible, but we'd still see that occlusion popping up. But now that this is invisible, if I go back over here to my Vray dirt, worker transparency is on. This light is not going to be affecting the occlusion pass at all, or the Vray dirt pass. Vray dirt is the same thing as an occlusion pass. Okay, so very important to have those 2 checkboxes on. Next is the extra text, the second one, and I also always, every time, add the Vray for now. Just leave it at the default 1.55 index of refraction, which is totally fine. Just a nice, really basic, subtle thing. But what this does is it's just going to add a nice edge wrap or an edge mat that I can use to sort of throw in edge highlights here and there in compositing, or, you know, reduce the intensity of things on the edges. It's just a really useful pass that I use all the time. So I just leave those 2 in there, and that is my basic setup for render elements that I have every time. So that's that. Vray common. Oh, the last thing I can do is %s /%l %s _%l. Now that sounds crazy, but basically all it's doing is %s is scene name, %l is render layer name, and %s, so then I'm doing scene name underscore render layer name. This is great if you're versioning up. If you've got like version 55 on your lighting file, it'll say lighting file version 55 / this is my beauty layer or my mattes layer or whatever, / lighting file 55 underscore beauty layer. Super handy when you're working with a bunch of scenes, or even if you're working with one scene, just to know what file did these renders come out of. Oh, they came out of file version 55 on that render layer. It's just a really quick way of saving all that information down. So that is that, and those are my basic render settings. And here's what I'm gonna do is go to presets. Now that I'm in the V-Ray tab, presets, save settings as preset, and I'm gonna call this basic V-Ray render settings, and save preset. And now I've got that when I go to load presets. Now you have to make sure that you're on V-Ray, because if I'm on Maya software, that preset's not going to show up. But if I'm on V-Ray, there's the preset. All right, and now let's just see what we've done actually. So let's take a light and just scoot it over here, and let's check its settings. That's going to be way too high. Let's just make it kind of orange. I don't know why. Why not? And let's do a quick render right here. So again, I've got my render view open down here in the corner. I've got my test resolution set to 25% of 1920, so it's only rendering 480 by 270. And let's just go here to render perspective camera. And there is our render. It is completely beautiful. Let's click on this little timestamp so we can see this. If you just, there's a little arrow down here and then a little timestamp button, and you can see how long the render took. So that was 3.2 seconds. Now if I want to save this for later, a lot of people use the history palette, which is somewhere down here, this H, and you can turn that on, and then you can set a location where you want to store these temporary files, and I'll just put them right here next to my streams. Call it temp stuff. That one's good. That's a good name for it. Sure, 200 megabytes on disk. That sounds great. And here I can just save that, and it'll save this, and that's all good. But it saves it with all the different passes available. There's our occlusion pass, or our dirt. There's our lighting. Diffuse is all pretty boring. Normals, reflection, there's none of that stuff. Sample rate, it's really useful for all sorts of things. And here's our V-Ray Fresnel pass. And just consider this like a black and white map. You know, the black areas down here are going to, you're not going to catch them very much, and you're going to be able to pick up these white areas. And I can actually show everybody that. I can take this into Photoshop real fast and do a little something. But I'm not going to yet because the render looks really bad and I want to make it look better first. So all right, so that's one thing to do, is the history palette. I don't like that much, just because, like I said, it's a little heavy, a little cumbersome. So I'm going to turn off the history palette, and I'm going to instead be sending my renders to the frame buffer down here. So if I click that little button, it comes up down here. I can save that and store it, and I prefer to do it that way. All right, so you can already see right off the bat that we're getting a lot of grain in this image. You can see it right here. It's pretty rough. So one thing I can do is take my light and just increase my samples to say 32, and we'll do another render real fast, and automatically it should start to look a little bit better, and it barely looks a little bit better. So what that means is I need to go higher on these samples. Actually, here, let's check our lighting pass. All right, so that's our lighting pass right there. Let's try 128. Let's just go nuts. So one thing I like to do a lot too is, and there you go, samples totally cleaned up. This looks significantly better now. And just to show you guys a before and after, this is our new one and our old one. Now, we did lose some of that GI bounce. I wonder why that happened. Oh, I am showing you guys the lighting pass. So instead, let's switch back to RGB by clicking that little RGB button, and we'll drop that in there, and there we go. So, no render time difference, but just adding more samples in that light all of a sudden this thing looks a lot better. So let's go to 256 because it's still kind of grainy. And this will probably get a tiny bit of a render hit. Yep, another 0.2 seconds, but our render looks still even better. All right, and you guys can see that down here. So there's our difference. It's subtle. It's subtle. It's not much, but it's enough. So another thing that's really important right now would be to actually turn on some V-Ray materials onto these objects, because another thing is you always want to be using V-Ray materials when you're using V-Ray. So I'm just going to select, I'll just select this one here and do right click, assign new material, and scroll down here and just grab this V-Ray material, and it's a nice gray one. Let's give it a little bit of reflectivity, actually a ton of reflectivity. Take the glossiness down, maybe 0.8. 8 samples should be fine. 5 reflections is kind of extreme for what we're doing, but who cares? That should do the trick. And we'll do the same thing for the torus. Assign new material and standard V-Ray material. Let's make this torus a different color though. Let's make it kind of a, let's make it more of a pinky purple something. I don't know why. I just think it might kind of look interesting. All right, let's add some reflectivity to that too. Let's take our glossiness to 0.8 and sure, let's try that out. And we're gonna do one more quick render here, and look at that. It's a donut. We have a donut. This is exactly what I was going for when we first started this. Man, I want to go get some donuts. Okay, there's nobody watching, so maybe I will go get some donuts. That sounds delicious. Okay, so now that we got the donut, let's just throw in one more light. Actually, okay, so before we do that, take a look at all this jaggedness. Now I can hit 3 on the keyboard and it's going to smooth that out and it's going to be beautiful, but V-Ray won't render that. We can get V-Ray to render that if we click on the render globals, go to the V-Ray setting and go to the global options, and in this checkbox right here, excuse me, render viewport subdivision. Now, render viewport subdivision, I used to use that all the time. It was awesome when it first came out because you didn't have to put smooth groups on stuff, and it was kind of a pain when V-Ray first started doing integration with Maya. So this button totally saved me a lot of time because I could just select everything in the scene and hit 3 on the keyboard, and then everything would get smooth and it was beautiful. But I started noticing that things were getting smooth at different rates and different times, and some things need to be smoothed more and other things need to be smoothed less. And then on top of that, when you're working with animation, you've got a giant scene that's all crazy characters, robots and stuff animating. If you hit 3 on the keyboard and let everything smooth itself, it's going to take forever just to navigate through that scene. Total nightmare. So I've opted away from using this render viewport subdivision. Now I leave it off. I leave everything at 1 in the viewport. That way it navigates really smoothly, or fast and smooth. And then I create a V-Ray smoothing group, and they've done a really great job with this. It's so much easier to use now. So I'm just going to select my object, go to Create, V-Ray, go down here to V-Ray displacement, and apply single V-Ray displacement node to selection. I do this all the time, so this is a really important piece here. So I'm going to create that thing. And if we go to our outliner, which I don't have up right now, so outliner, there it is. You can see that we created this V-Ray displacement group. Oh, that's off screen a little bit. There we go. Created this V-Ray displacement group here, and I'm just going to rename this VR disp smooth. So VR disp for V-Ray displacement, and smooth because that's what I'm doing for this smooth group. I'm just smoothing stuff. I'm not adding any displacement, no maps, no craziness. This is just to smooth objects. So now that I have this selected, go up here to the attribute editor and click on attributes, the V-Ray attribute. We're going to add a subdivision, and we're also going to add subdivision and displacement quality. So here, this is overriding my global settings. Now those are the same global settings that I set over here in settings, default, displacement, and subdivision. So my global settings would be view dependent off with max subdiv set at 4. I'm going to override that with this group, anything that's inside of this group. For example, right now it's just this torus. And if I say make a bunch of other objects, I can just middle click and drag new objects into that smooth group, and then they'll also get smoothed. All right, so I'm also going to turn on view dependent. Max subdivs at 4 is probably fine to start, but my edge length set to 4 is going to be probably too big. So what that means is if you look at one of these edges, this is my edge length. This is my threshold. If this is bigger than 4, it will render. If it's it'll render normal. If it's less than 4, is that right? No. If this is longer than 4, anyway, what it means is you got to make sure that these are small enough to fit inside of this edge length at 4, and it's probably not going to be. So we can just test it really fast, and I'm just going to get really close to the model and hit a render. And you can see, that's right, it's lines that are shorter than 4 will not get smoothed. Lines that are larger than 4 will get smoothed. Now, I can tell you right now that this line is way smaller than 4, because if we look at our grid, 4 as in 4 units, sorry if that was unclear. 4 units. So if I look at this grid here, and here's 1, 2, 3, 4 units. Obviously, this little tiny line here is not 4 units wide. So this is not going to get smoothed. And if you look at the model, none of this is going to get smoothed because it's all way bigger than 4. Sorry, way smaller than 4. So, and you can see right there in the render, you know, that's just not smoothing anything at all. So we'll get it from kind of a side where we can actually see it a little bit better. Just stop that. All right, cool. This'll be nice. Oh, and I turned on this little chase mouse thing too, so that way my buckets will follow my mouse. It's kind of nice. All right, so there's our faceted edge. Looks totally terrible. And let's fix that. So if I go back here to the smooth, I'm gonna set this to 1, and this is gonna smooth a lot of it, but there's still gonna be some things that don't get smoothed. And especially these short ones on the side. These long ones that are going laterally along the donut probably are getting smoothed. But we can't really tell because these short ones are a little more obvious. So I'm going to go even smaller on this. I'm going to go to 0.1 on my edge length. You just see that maybe that's small enough that we can start smoothing. We can start seeing this stuff get smoothed. And sure enough, it is. So those edge lengths are bigger than 0.1, so that they are now being smoothed. And they're being smoothed with the maximum subdivisions of 4. So that's basically like taking this object and going right click, smooth, and then turning the divisions up to 4. So let's just click this and go to 4. Kapow. So that's basically what's happening at render time. We're getting all this smoothing amount by this many divisions for faces and edges that are less than 0.1 length. Okay, little crazy, but there you go. There you have it. Smooth stuff. Looks beautiful. So if you throw your objects inside of a smoothing group, like a V-Ray displacement smoothing group like this, and your stuff is not smoothing, just keep on reducing the edge length until it does. And sometimes I really have to go down to 0.001. And this is sort of a fail-safe. If you have a bunch of objects in your scene and you're really not really sure what your scene scale is, and you got to move really fast and you're not sure what to do, you can just put this to 0.001 and it will guarantee that every single object in the scene will get smoothed. That does also guarantee that your render times will probably go up quite significantly, because now V-Ray has to calculate every single thing, including this plane that doesn't need to be smoothed, and has to smooth that to the same 4 levels of subdivision that this object has to be smoothed at. So I mean, it is kind of it's an overkill, but it's one of those things where if you're stressing out and you're racing and you're against the deadline and you don't have time to sit and diagnose what your edge length should be, you can just drop that down to 0.001 and it will be good to go. Okay, so that's that. It's pretty fun. This is a really weird looking render. I'm also going to add a dome light in here. It's pretty standard affair. So V-Ray dome, and I'll show you my initial settings for a dome light. I always have it invisible, because you want, if it's visible, it'll actually screw up your alpha. it'll exist in the alpha too, so you won't be able to pull a background and put a new background in. And it also kind of messes up if you're trying to matte stuff out of stuff, and you're gonna have this tiny little like subpixel aliased edge around the edge. It's kind of annoying, so we're gonna ignore that. All right, so we set this to invisible, and dome spherical. I always use that as well. Well, it depends, but almost always. Use dome text. So let's just do this. This is where most people would plug in an HDRI image or something like that, which is great. You can throw that right into dome text here. Instead, I am going to use a ramp. And this again is my total basic startup. I always use a ramp, unless I need to use an HDRI. If I'm doing an outdoor scene where I'm matching a plate, if I'm matching live footage to a CG object, or a CG object to live footage, absolutely you have to use an HDR. But if you're doing anything that doesn't necessarily need to match something perfectly, ramps are awesome, provide a ton of creative control, and just overall a much easier thing to work with, I think, is to try to build a ramp HDRI replacement. So my typical setup basically is sky on the right side and then ground on the left side. So around the 50% mark, roughly, I'm just going to put a horizon line in. And what that means is just a nice dark patch to sort of complement the bright patch. And we're going to make this just a little bit darker there. And then this is going to get a little brighter. So here's kind of what my thought process is while I'm setting these ramps up. And here, let's start tinting these a little bit more towards blue. So here's how this looks. Imagine this flipped over 90 degrees this way. Take this edge and stack it up to the top, and it goes down. So what this is a sky. Here's our horizon line. This is where our mountain level would be, or our ground, and then from here down is ground. And because this is a spherical or a full dome, this is going to be our mountains off in the far, far distance. This is going to be sort of stuff that's maybe a mile or half a mile away. And then this is everything that's right underneath our feet. And usually right underneath our feet, we're sometimes standing in a light source, or we're near some sort of a light source that's bouncing back up onto us. So this is to sort of simulate, like a spotlight underneath us. And then, things get a little darker as we go back in distance, and then they brighten up again right before we hit our horizon. And then the horizon, we've got our brightest areas. This is where our sun probably is going to be. It depends on what time of day you're trying to go for. And then as we get higher, things get a little darker and richer and more saturated until they sort of reach this maximum level of saturation and darkness at the very, very peak of our HDR. And just do something like that, and just tint it a little bit towards the purple realm. Okay. So there we go. I mean, that's something. That's something. I'm also going to switch this to smooth. Excuse me one second. Got my pink drink here. Let's go along with my pink donut. All right, cool. That's much better. And you kind of want these to be kind of close to each other, because you want this to be like a sharp horizon line. If you wanted a smooth horizon line, that's fine. You can do that too. I mean, the only reason you would want to use a smooth horizon line is if you had a bunch of haze that you were trying to simulate. If you look off in the distance, maybe it was a dust storm, so that like the horizon line where the edge of the mountains meet the sky is sort of blurred for some reason. Or if you wanted to fake blurry reflections on an object without having to actually calculate the blurry reflections. If you have like this torus would be perfect, because there's nothing else reflecting into it. So I wouldn't have to show these blurry reflections. I could just have a blurry HDR or ramp for that matter, and it would look like there are blurry reflections on here. But for now, we'll just leave it all hard like this. And I'm also so I always tint the sky a little warm, a little cool, and then I tint the ground a little warm. And that just helps bounce the light around a little bit more naturally. So we'll do something like that. That's good. And just a tiny bit of warmth right there is probably going to be pretty helpful. Awesome. Okay, now we have a dome light in here, and set the value to 1, which is looking great. All right, and let's just go over here and render our new dome lit scene. Whoa, all right. All right, so that all looks exactly correct. And you'll see, however, that we've gotten pretty grainy again in our map. And that, of course, makes sense because if I go back to our lighting pass, now our lighting is totally grain town. And that is because our dome light, which is massive and filling up the entire scene with illumination, only has 8 subdivs on it. And if you look at our rectangle light, and in order to get rid of our grain on our rectangle light, we had to go all the way up to 256 on the subdivs, and that's just coming out of this tiny little square. Now, if you can imagine that every direction from every way from everywhere is this other light coming in, 8 is just totally inadequate. So let's start with 256. Now, probably gonna need to go higher than that, probably 512 or more. But let's just start with this and see how much better that looks. Okay, still pretty grainy, and but it doesn't look like the grainy is necessarily coming so much from our light subdivs anymore, because this looks a lot better. So our graininess is now coming more from our reflections, and that makes perfect sense as well. So let's take our material and bump this up to, say, 32. Let's try that. And our material for our donut, and bump that up to 32 as well. And we'll just stay on the reflection tab and watch as this gets better. Now it's getting better, but it's nowhere near done or cleaned up. So what we're really going to do is go to like 128 on these materials, 128 again, and we'll do another render, and this should look considerably better. And it does. All right, fantastic. Awesome, awesome. And here's our donut looking just glorious. He's so happy. All right, and let's mess with the settings just a little bit on this donut. Let's actually put our reflection glossiness to like 0.6. You can kind of see in the material preview up here. 0.6 is probably going to be a little bit more donut looking like. I mean, it's still going to be way too reflective, but it's a step in the right direction. And it's just going to soften it out a little bit. It's going to look pretty nice. Of course, my framing is all a little funky, but I think that's okay. Yeah. So that's that. What do we have here? Consider turning down settings. Okay, so it's high CPU usage. Hopefully. Oh, look at that. So this is my first tutorial. So I can see that my render settings are probably a little too intensive. So what I can do is actually, let's actually open up Task Manager to Maya and set our affinities, and let's just release our, say, number 11 node. And what that should do is always allow one processor for handling all of the streaming stuff, and the compressions and all that stuff. So I can see now that it looks like that may have fixed our issue. Great. Beautiful. All right, done deal. So that is basically a look at initial render settings in Vray and how to start lighting, and some of the stuff you may just want to get in there before you actually start messing with some scenes. And I can go into some more lighting tutorials as we go, but this is just my first stream, and I just kind of wanted to test it out. And you know, anybody who's listening or watching, thanks very much for being here. And anybody who's not, you're missing out, because there's going to be a lot of good stuff coming. All right, well, thanks everybody, and I'm going to stop streaming now, and I'll probably start streaming again a little later. All right, bye.